Back in 1987, when Warhammer 40K was first released, it wasn't the franchise that we all know today. Back then, it was called Rogue Trader and played more like a grimdark version of Dungeons & Dragons, complete with a game master and a focus on RPG-style storytelling. The War for Rynn's world served as the setting for the book's only scenario, the Battle at the Farm. For many players, this was their very first taste of wargaming in the grimdark future. In a sense, everything in this franchise, from the Horus Heresy all the way to the rise of the Primaris Marines, can trace its roots back to Rynn's world. Now, the Rogue Trader rulebook introduced more than just one battle. It laid the groundwork for the entire setting, from the Emperor of Mankind to the tone of the universe to the earliest descriptions of how Space Marines were created. As some of 40K's oldest lore in existence, the War for Rynn's world and the chapter of Space Marines that call it home, the Crimson Fist, have evolved dramatically over the decades. So in today's video, we're going to explore the lore behind the Crimson Fist and the War for Rynn's world, from its humble origins into one of the most important and brutal conflicts in 40K canon. From the apocalyptic destruction of Arx Tyrannus to the sewer wars beneath New Rynn City to a final stand in a place called Traitor's Gorge. We're even going to be talking about one of the biggest accidents to have ever occurred in the history of the Imperium, one that is both the source of dozens of conspiracy theories and almost wiped out the entirety of the Crimson Fist chapter. We're going to be talking about all that and a whole lot more, but before we dive headfirst into the grimdark, this video is sponsored by Factor, who makes meeting your nutritional goals easier than ever. Factor delivers fresh, never-frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep, each one crafted by a team of gourmet chefs using only ingredients with integrity that help you feel your best all day long. Now, being a YouTuber is definitely not a hard job, but the hours can get kind of crazy, and I'll be honest, time management never been my best skill. That's why I use Factor as my go-to lunch or dinner solution whenever I'm on the run or working on a big project. They got over 35 meals to choose from each week that are all ready in just 2 minutes. With Factor, I save a ton of time by cutting out cooking, food prep, and trips to the grocery store. And it doesn't matter what type of lifestyle or diet plan you favor, as Factor has something for everyone, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, Vegan, and Vegetarian. My favorite part about using Factor is just how flexible they are. They make it easy to adjust my order size on the fly. I can add meals to my plan if I know I'm going to have a week where I'm particularly busy, or even remove some if I've got some time off or a special event planned. If you want to start saving both time and money and taking your nutrition seriously, then head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50WesHammer to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free shipping. That's code 50WesHammer at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Big thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. After you've been into Warhammer 40K for a certain amount of time, you'll inevitably hear about the legendary Rynn's world. Now sure, it's not as famous as other planets in the setting such as Terra or Mars, and the campaigns that involve it are not as galaxy-defining as those fought on the surfaces of Armageddon or Cadia. But Rynn's world, its main campaign, and the Space Marines that call it home have something that all the others don't. They were the very first. As I mentioned in the intro of this video, this is where Warhammer 40K truly began. The core rulebook for 40K's first edition, which was known as Rogue Trader, released back in 1987. This is the book that debuted the Crimson Fist chapter of Space Marines, which is the one that this story is primarily going to focus on. Now sure, it's true that the Fists were not the only chapter introduced in this book, as we also learned about the Dark Angels, the Flesh Terrors, the Silver Skulls, and the Rainbow Warriors, just to name a few. But the Crimson Fist were the first poster boys of the franchise, a role that would later get passed between other chapters before eventually being permanently handed over to the Ultramarines in and around 4th edition. And fun fact, as the idea for successor chapters, it didn't really exist in the lore at this point in time. The Crimson Fists were actually introduced to the setting before their founding chapter, the Imperial Fists. Now, before we dive into the battle for Rynn's world proper, there's a few things we need to establish first, including the history of everything that was going on right before the battle started, and the 2 major players that are involved in this scenario, those being the aforementioned Crimson Fists and the Orcs of Was Snagrud. And we'll start with the Fists. This isn't going to be a full comprehensive deep dive of them, as they're on the list to get their own dedicated video in the future. But in the meantime, there's a few key things that you need to know about their history and personality, as it's going to be relevant to the story. The main thing that you need to know about is how they differ from the other Imperial Fist successors, as their founding was rather unique. You see, their Primarch, Rogel Dorn, was not originally on board with the implementation of the Codex Astartes and the breaking up of the Space Marine legions after the Horus Heresy. That being said, his opinions would, however, eventually change, after he got most of his legion killed when he was baited into a trap by his brother Perturabo during the Battle of the Iron Cage, a battle that he and his sons only managed to survive when the Ultramarines showed up to save the day. After this event, he agreed to Roboute Guilliman's plan and split what remained of his legion into 3 chapters, one that would carry the legion's original name of the Imperial Fist, one that fully embraced the Codex and its teachings, the Crimson Fists, and one who spurned it entirely, the Black Templars. Now, unlike the Imperial Fists, who famously have a fixation with fortifications and siege warfare, and the Black Templars, who are, respectfully, a bunch of frothing zealots, the Crimson Fists prefer tactical flexibility in order to solve problems as pragmatically as possible. This mentality would be pushed to its absolute limit when their homeworld found itself in the path of Warboss Snagrod's Great Wog, one of the most devastating orc incursions the Imperium had ever faced. The Waaagh erupted from the Loki sector, with nearly every orc tribe there united under Snagrod's leadership. Known to the Imperium as the arch-arsonist of Caradon, Snagrod was a rare breed amongst orcs, both brutally cunning and cunningly brutal. He was said to be an absolute monster of a war boss, rivaling even Ghazghkull in sheer size. But unlike most orcs, Snagrod possessed a terrifying strategic mind. He had a talent for mimicking advanced Imperial tactics, and during his warpath, he developed a ruthless playbook. One of his most famous strategies being the strategic elimination of enemy astropaths first, thus cutting off any hope of calling for reinforcements as the green tide descended upon his enemies. This strategy made his victories swift, brutal, and often completely undetected, at least until it was too late. By the time Rynn's world realized that it was next, the Waaagh had already crashed through Imperial space like a green tsunami. The grim reality that the Crimson Fists were facing here was that they didn't have the time or numbers to raise a proper counterforce. Instead, Pedro Cantor, the chapter master of the Fist, came up with a plan to weaken the Waaagh before it reached Rynn's world, via a series of smaller raids against them on planets that were along their route. The first of such raids was done by a strike force consisting of elements from the 10th and 3rd companies under the command of Captain Draken. The strike force would end up meeting the orcs on the world of Bad Landing. Fighting alongside 3 full regiments of the Imperial Guard, Draken was pretty confident of victory. However, things would quickly go tits up when a Space Marine scout defied direct orders and took a potshot with his sniper rifle at Snagrod in a moment of opportunity. In the scout's defense, he had the Warlord in his line of sight, and he knew that he could end this thing right here and now, as an orc Waaagh tends to fall apart without strong leadership. But Captain Draken still denied the request. It was far too risky and would alert the orcs to their position regardless if the shot connected or not. Lacking experience and respect for the chain of command, the scout ignored Draken's order and took the shot. He managed to hit his mark, but what he didn't realize was that the Warlord had a custom force field that completely negated the attack. Now detected and outnumbered, what followed was a wholesale slaughter of the Imperial forces. Captain Draken was slain in the ensuing carnage, and the Crimson Fists were forced into full retreat. The world of Bad Landing fell shortly after the Astartes left the planet. Of the 84 Space Marines that had been sent here, only 28 returned home. The loss of Captain Draken, combined with this disastrous defeat, brought an end to the Crimson Fist's raids on the orcs before they had even really started. They couldn't afford to lose more Astartes, especially with the Waaagh now barreling full speed towards Rynn's world. Worse still, it massively demoralized the chapter ahead of the invasion. The entire time the Fists were preparing for the invasion, organizing the PDFs, securing civilians, there was this dark cloud over the command staff. A large part of the dismal mood was because of that scout who took the shot. He was a very promising Astartes, but Pedro Cantor had no choice. By the laws of the chapter, he had to order his execution. His actions had directly led to a captain's death, and he could no longer be trusted to follow orders. Ultimately, he was a liability. In contrast to the somber mood of the command staff, one figure burned with fury rather than grief: Captain Alessio Cortez of the 4th Company. He was within inches of executing the insubordinate scout himself and longed for nothing more than vengeance on the orcs. vengeance that he would soon have the opportunity to reap, as Wa Snagrod had arrived in orbit. The planet's first line of resistance against the incoming Orc Wa consisted of nearly the entire Crimson Fist fleet alongside a host of allied Imperial vessels and all of the planet's orbital defense platforms. Now, you think that would be enough, right? Like, at the very least, it would put up a solid defense? Well, unfortunately for the defenders of mankind here, it was an absolute slaughter. The coordinated Orc assault burst from the warp and descended upon the defenders like a ferocious green tide, striking hard, fast, and drowning them in sheer numbers. Within hours, the planet's carefully constructed naval defenses were nothing more than drifting wreckage. Now, the Crimson Fist weren't stupid, nor dangerously optimistic. They were well aware of what they were up against. The goal here wasn't total victory, it was to inflict as much attrition as possible. The Orc ships themselves were not the main threat, it was their nasty green payloads that they were carrying. Every ship destroyed here in orbit would be considerably less Orcs to face on the ground. The plan was remarkably simple. Inflict as much damage as possible, then get any surviving ships out to call for reinforcements. But technically speaking, the plan did work, but there were far less surviving ships than was hoped for. In fact, it was only one single vessel, the Crusader, that managed to escape. And I use that term pretty loosely here, as it had taken catastrophic damage. The effort to get the Crusader out of the system was a monumental one, Pedro Cantor having to order Sevel Ranpar, the Crimson Fist master of the fleet and close personal friend, to his death. Unfortunately for the chapter master, Ranpar's death would just be the first of numerous deep wounds that this campaign would inflict upon him. Now, maybe you've caught on at this point, but the entire invasion of Rynn's world follows this horrific pattern of the Crimson Fist doing everything right, and it's still going horribly wrong. Yet, there was a ray of hope in the Void War. Not just that a single ship had managed to escape, but that there were two others, the Prosperin and the Hadrius. Now, these vessels were too far away to be recalled in time for the defense of the planet, and more importantly, they had been guarding a vital supply line that stretched from Rynn's world and beyond the Orc Wa. And before we go any further, I should make a quick mention here that if you're not aware of how an Orc Wall works, it's more than just a spearhead of ships. And when we refer to it with flowery language that conjures images of floods, tidal waves, or rushing water, it's a lot more accurate than you may think. Was don't so much as invade, but crash over a world, leaving them devastated and crawling with orcs. Every planet afflicted becomes a staging ground, transformed into a kind of brutal playground from which the orcs launch more ships, often as privateering scouts. This particular supply line was Rynn's world's best connection to the wider Imperium, and the main route any reinforcements would need to take. With the orbital defenses in tatters, the orcs would begin to ferry their troops to the surface, but the Crimson Fists were ready. This was where they really planned on breaking the invaders, and thus had prepared a multitude of defenses for the imminent ground campaign. At the center of their plans was their fortress monastery, the Arx Tyrannus, nestled deep in the Hellblade Mountains. It was a perfect defensive structure, and the Crimson Fist had deliberately baited the orcs into attacking it. The Greenskins fell for the trap, with the vast majority of their landers heading straight for the fortress. Meanwhile, each of the planet's cities had been fortified with PDF forces, and more of the population had been conscripted to assist in the defense. However, the only city to truly receive Astartes support was New Rynn City, the planet's capital and the seat of the planetary governor. It would be Captain Drigo Elves of the Second Company who was placed in charge of the city's defense, leading a detachment composed of various elements from the chapter, including warriors from the vaunted First Company. However, he was less than happy with this assignment, and that's for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it meant that he wasn't going to be joining his brothers in the main battle. But perhaps more importantly, the vast majority of the defenders of this city would be the Rensguard, humans partially trained by the Crimson Fist to garrison the homeworld. They were about as well trained as any guardsman regiment, but Elves held a pretty negative opinion of baseline mortals and felt they made for piss-poor fighters. The main battle for the planet would begin as soon as the Orc invaders entered the space around the Fist's fortress. The Arch Tyrannus' orbital guns unleashed a thunderstorm of missiles that obliterated the first wave of Orc landers mid-air. though incalculably more were still on their way, and the fortress's guns could not hold them in the sky. The orcs would inevitably make planetfall all around the fortress, rushing it in vast waves of infantry and tanks. Pedro Cantor and a handful of others were conducting a last-minute inspection of the fortress monastery's defenses when it happened. Now, as we established earlier in the story, every time things seem to be going well here, a tragedy is inevitably right around the corner, and this moment was easily the darkest in the chapter's history. Now, it's human nature to try to explain tragedy. Our minds can't accept the chaotic randomness of an uncaring universe, and thus we try to find meaning, purpose, and reason when things seem their darkest. In an ironic twist, individuals in-universe and fans of 40K for years have ventured that what occurred next was no mere accident, but a monumentous conspiracy theory, many claiming that the Inquisition was somehow involved. The targeting system of a vortex missile fired from the chapter's own Laucum batteries failed. The missile danced above the fortress as the defenders watched on in horror, before plummeting like a figurative guillotine above the chapter's neck. Dropping nose first, it penetrated meters of solid rock before arriving at the chapter's munitions store. The explosion was apocalyptic. In an instant, the Crimson Fist lost nearly everything. Their fortress was annihilated, the vast majority of the chapter's warriors killed outright, their gene seed reserves, thousands of years worth of genetic legacy, was lost forever. This should be where the story ends. Wa Snagrod is one of the greatest Was the Imperium had ever faced. It broke countless worlds in seconds, and for any other chapter with any other Astartes in command, that would be the case. This would be their final stand, and they would join the Emperor's finest, enshrined in glory at his side. But these are the Crimson Fists, and Pedro Cantor was no ordinary space marine. Following the detonation of Arx Tyrannus, the defenders of Rynn's world were in shock. Those Crimson Fists who survived the blast didn't have time to grieve. Orcs were already swarming the ruins of the fortress, and the badly wounded were slain where they lay. Those still able to fight made their final stand or fell back, gathering wounded brothers where they could. Though they were surrounded, outnumbered, and facing down enemy tanks, their destruction seemed inevitable. Reports of what happened next are somewhat chaotic to say the least. According to the 5th edition Space Marine Codex, a land raider named Rynn's Might narrowly dodged the vortex missile and, completely uncrewed, proceeded to defeat the entire Wa by itself in a single night. Though that story may hold some shred of truth, it's far more likely to have been overly exaggerated and turned into Imperial propaganda. The events described in the novel Rynn's World, however, paint a much darker picture. Many of the Crimson Fists had broken under the weight of the tragedy. Pedro Cantor nearly collapsed at the sight of their ruined home. Alessio Cortez was found atop a mound of rubble, screaming like a madman as he fired his bolt pistol at the encroaching orcs. Alessio and Pedro were as close as any two Astartes could be, and it was a small comfort to Cantor that his old friend had survived. But out of the 600 Crimson Fists stationed at Arx Tyrannus, only 16 remained. Even so, Cantor immediately began organizing a retreat of his surviving warriors. Cortez, however, was consumed by rage. He demanded vengeance, calling for a mad charge, insisting that his armor be slick with orc gore. Cantor understood his friend's pain, but he also knew such a charge was suicide. And so, the last 16 defenders of Arx Tyrannus abandoned their shattered home, retreating into the war-torn mountains as the orcs picked over the ruins of the once proud fortress. All across the planet, the orcs were rushing at the Imperials, not even stopping to regroup. They began hurling themselves at the wall of every major city. Most fell quickly, their defenders completely overwhelmed by the might of Wa Snagrod. New Rynn City, however, was different, as Captain Alves had been supplied with 400 Astartes to assist in the defense, and they had been prepping for months. So when the first waves of the orcs began to break against their walls, the Crimson Fists reaped a heavy toll. None of the defenders truly understood the full scale of what they were facing, a reality that would be revealed to them in the cold light of dawn. Orcs in the millions, filling the landscape completely, from the walls of New Rynn City out past the horizon. Yet worse still for the Crimson Fish stationed here was news of Arx Tyrannus' destruction. Whereas Cortez had fell into a fury and Cantor had been consumed with sorrow, Alves responded with cold bitterness and unshakable stoicism. For him, the loss became fuel for his contempt towards mortals. When Alves went to check on the outer defenses of the capital, he was greeted in the streets by crowds of frightened people, cheering to see the Crimson Fists marching to their defense. Alves spurned them, terrorized them, and destroyed what little morale they had left. Even Alves' own brothers were concerned at the sheer contempt he displayed for them. Yet when an orc transport crashed within the city, Alves personally led the cleansing effort. This would establish a clear pattern for him. Wherever the greatest threat in the city was, so was Alves, clad in his Terminator armor and wielding his relic sword and storm bolter, which admittedly were some of the last relics the chapter still possessed. Now, while all that's going on, Cantor, Cortez, and the few survivors from Arch Tyrannus' destruction were slowly picking their way down from the Hellblade Mountains. They dodged patrols and raiding bands as they began a slow and desperate march to New Rynn City. It's during this journey that Cantor and the survivors find a downed lightning pilot and get a rough update on the world's situation. The news was grim. In the short few days the Astartes had spent descending from the mountains, everywhere but New Rynn City had fallen. And for them, the journey would be perilous. It was all the way on the other side of the planet. But unfortunately, it was also their only option. It was also on this long journey, though, that the famous Battle at the Farm would take place. As I mentioned in the video's intro, this was the very first pitched battle in Warhammer 40K's history, the original scenario put forth in the Rogue Trader core rulebook. Now, although it's definitely true that the actual lore for the franchise stretches way further back than this point, in the real-world history of 40K and the production of its lore, this was the single oldest battle in the setting, and is absolutely iconic. Now, the fluff we're given in the original version is admittedly kinda silly. Back then, 40K didn't take itself nearly as seriously as it does today, and ever since, there's been this gradual, grim darkening of the setting. Though even still in future retellings, its core DNA would remain intact. In the original, just like in the modern lore, Cantor and the survivors come to the farm after the destruction of their fortress via a malfunctioning missile. Though where the Rogue Trader scenario is more concerned with an orc hiding his precious jewels, the modern lore is far darker. Cantor and the survivors had been traveling for days since their encounter with the downed lightning pilot. Cortez and his squad, however, were scouting ahead of the main party. Night had fallen, and the Crimson Fist knew that due to the orcs' poor night vision, this was their best time to move. The area they were moving through was dotted with farmsteads, and the Marines had been doing their best to avoid them. Each one was an easy target for bloodthirsty orcs, and the Crimson Fist couldn't risk discovery. Yet, when Cortez and his warriors encountered an extremely bright light coming from a farm on the edge of the woods, they went to investigate. What they found was a giant bonfire and orcs who were torturing a farmer and his family. Cortez was so outraged at the cruelty of the orcs that he ordered an attack. Cantor and the remaining Marines arrived shortly after Cortez had begun his assault. He swiftly joined the fray, despite being furious at his recklessness, as this attack had risked everything. After the fighting was done and they ensured that no orcs had escaped, Cantor dressed down Cortez for his actions. But he could only bring himself to scold his brother lightly. The truth was, the same rage burning in Cortez lived in Cantor too. The battle had ultimately been cathartic for all of them. But the aftermath had brought a new dilemma for the Marines. The farmer had been slain, but his wife and children still lived. If the Crimson Fist left them, more orcs would undoubtedly come, and even if that weren't the case, with their farm a smoking ruin, they would surely starve. Now, tactically speaking, all the Marines knew that they needed to leave these people to die. Cortez was the biggest advocate of this heartless yet necessary approach, and admittedly, Cantor had to agree with his logic, but the decision left him deeply unsettled. At first, the Marines didn't really pay much attention to the civilians at all, but when the survivors began to follow them, Cortez protested. Now, Cantor agreed with him verbally, but he never gave the order for the Marines to increase their pace. And when the mother collapsed from exhaustion, Cantor simply picked her up and carried her. No one said a word. Even Cortez stayed silent. None protested this clear shift in doctrine, even if it endangered them tactically. Pedro Cantor was the chapter master because In Cortez's own words, he was the best of them. He had something more to him, a quiet dignity, or something like true honor. Cortez couldn't comprehend why his chapter master was carrying this human woman, or why Cantor let the refugees follow them, yet deep down, something in him respected him for it. Even still, Cortez couldn't truly acknowledge this, for inside him was only burning blood and the need for vengeance. He wanted to scream, to rage, to kill every last orc for what they had done. He couldn't even pity the children who watched their father be butchered. He didn't even think about them. Cantor, though, Cantor felt for these people, even if he didn't want to admit it to himself. That despite all of his conditioning, all of the gifts the God Emperor had given him, he cared for the suffering of mortals. He had something thought lost in most Marines: true compassion. What is really interesting is that although his brothers didn't understand why he acted with this compassion, hell, they even derided him for it a little bit, they still admired him. Part of them wanted that spark of humanity that he had. They wanted to feel that righteous rage that came only to those who protect the weak they care for, to have a deeper fealty to humanity. As the Marines, and now the wagon trail of civilians, made their way through the countryside, New Rynn City was fighting a desperate defense. For every inch of ground the orcs took, thousands of their boys were slaughtered, yet they kept coming. Even the city's sewers had become a brutal battleground after Captain Alves discovered that the orcs were using them to launch ambushes behind Imperial lines. In response, he ordered every Terminator under his command into the tunnels. The sewers soon became choked with orc corpses. The decision to clear out these tunnels, though Alves had no way of knowing it, would single-handedly guarantee his chapter master's survival. Despite the defenders' tenacity, the sheer weight of numbers eventually forced them back. Yet so stubborn were they that even isolated pockets cut off from the main defense lines continued fighting until the end of the siege. In fact, one group, a handful of Rynn's Guard and a couple of Crimson Fist, managed to hold out for nearly half of the campaign despite being completely cut off. Though nothing probably demonstrates this more than the sacrifice of Captain Alves. The orcs were overrunning the first ring of the city, and the Crimson Fist needed more time to fall back. Alves gave it to them. Taking the rear guard alone, the Crimson Fist watched their captain, their leader, and the man who, as far as they were aware, was the last captain of their chapter, take up his sword and Stormbolter and hold the line. He kept the orcs back long enough for their forces to retreat and the gates to be sealed. The last they saw of Alves was him screaming bloody defiance, his back to the gate and a pile of dead orcs around him. Yet still, even after the gate shut and his fate was sealed, he kept on fighting. His life signal finally flickered out when he was slain by the war boss Orzog Magkol. Shortly after the last stand of Captain Alves, Cantor and his band reached the outskirts of New Rynn City, where he encountered one of the strangest orc facilities ever documented in Imperial history, an orc experimentation lab. Inside, it appeared like the Greenskins had been performing crude surgeries on human captives, turning them into grotesque, fleshy battle automatons. The scene was honestly more reminiscent of something you'd find with the Dark Eldar homunculi than what we would consider typical orc behavior. Among the twisted remains, Cantor confronted the mad pain boy responsible, an orc wearing a human face as a mask. Outraged and disgusted, Cantor slew the creature without hesitation. But this was a grim reminder of what would happen to the world if New Rynn City fell. When the city walls came into view, Cantor ordered the civilians to a safe hiding place where they could wait out the siege. With his charges secure, he and the surviving Crimson Fist slipped into the city's sewer system, hoping to reach the remaining defenders. This is where Captain Alves' decision to cleanse the sewers proved invaluable. Thanks to his efforts, Cantor's group was able to navigate the tunnels and link up with the veterans of the First Company that were still holding them. By this point in the siege, the defenders controlled only the central citadel. The rest of the city had fallen, and the orcs had seized the spaceport, turning it into a staging ground for endless air assaults. Only the Bastion's formidable anti-air defenses kept the skies remotely contested, but even then, the defenders were under near constant bombardment. Shortly after returning with his brothers, Cantor learned that Snagrod, the architect of the entire invasion, was inside that spaceport. More than that, he had been sighted on one of the airfields. seemingly directing the offense personally. Losing no time, Cantor and Cortez sought to slay the beast, using the sewers, which, thanks to Alvez's foresight, meant that the Crimson Fist could assault anywhere in the city. Cantor led a strike force to retake the spaceport and kill Snagrod. Cortez, of course, joined the assault, but, as is tradition, rushed ahead of Cantor, eager to claim the war boss's head for himself. When Cantor caught up to him, the only thing he could find of his friend was a severed arm. Cantor was momentarily devastated before being interrupted by a one-armed Cortez stumbling into the room. Taken aback by his friend's survival, he began to admonish him for his hot-headed actions, which, I'll admit, led to a kind of funny scene. He tells him, "You lost an arm, Alessio, by the mercy of the Emperor alone. You're lucky you didn't lose your life." To which Cortez replied to him, "I haven't lost an arm, brother. It's right over there," pointing at the arm on the ground. Whoever said the Imperial Fist and their successors didn't have a sense of humor was out of their mind. Anyways, turns out that Cortez had not engaged Snagrod at all, but Warboss Orzhov Magkol, which was the same one who slew Captain Alvez earlier in the story. Now, he did lose an arm, that's definitely true, but he had managed to grievously wound the Warboss, which made it easy for Cantor to finish him off. After this, Cantor would end up facing off against Snagrod alone, as he didn't want to risk any more of his brothers. Their duel was absolutely legendary, and whereas you think this might be something of an even match, that was absolutely not the case. Cantor obviously had the upper hand, as he channeled all of his fury, all that he had lost, into every blow. He drove the warboss to his knees, took his arm, and forced him onto his back. Yet, this wouldn't be the end for Snagrod, just like it wasn't the end of the war for Rynn's world. With the last of the warboss's strength, he threw Cantor back and fled on an orc gunship. With Snagrod humbled, the spaceport retaken, and the orcs on the retreat, the defenders of New Rynn City had something they had thought lost with the destruction of Arx Tyrannus: hope. This sentiment was swiftly rewarded as Imperial reinforcements arrived in the system. In total, the siege of New Rynn City had lasted for 532 days. In that time, the Crimson Fist chapter had lost everything. Most of the planet's population lay dead, and the chapter had been reduced to around 100 Astartes. Though they had suffered greatly, the Crimson Fist had broken Wa Snagrod. The Imperial reinforcements were utterly vital in finally ending the Wa proper, but it had been on the walls of New Rynn City that Wa Snagrod met its end. Yet, the war for Rynn's world didn't end with the Imperial reinforcements. The final battle for Rynn's world was fought long after Snagrod was dead. The reinforcements had left, and the Wog was completely shattered. The Crimson Fist had been left to mop up the last of the orcs and secure their homeworld. It started with a Crimson Fist assault on an orc fuel depot. Pedro Cantor and 2 squads of tactical marines pursued the orcs who were retreating from the ruined depot, hoping to find their base in the hills. Instead, however, they would end up following the orcs into a location that would become legend: Traitor's Gorge. When the Fist entered the gorge, they had to fight through a tight rocky corridor, which was the only way in or out. They quickly dispatched the orcs that they had been chasing, only to find that they were surrounded. The cliffs and caves of the gorge were teeming with orcs. Soon, they began to rush the Fists, pouring down off the hills and through the narrow passage and out of the caves. The Fists formed a defensive ring and began scything down the orcs. They had no hope of extraction, as every Thunderhawk left to the chapter had been too badly damaged to fly. With no reinforcements anywhere near, Pedro Cantor and his 2 scores of Astartes were the only standing forces. They would either fight their way out, or they would die here. The orcs were unrelenting, a seemingly endless horde charging at the Fists. Their supplies had already been low when they entered the gorge, but while they still had ammunition, not one orc got within a hair's breadth of an Astartes. Such was the skill of the Sons of Dorn with a bolter. Yet when their magazines eventually ran dry, they formed a ring of blades, combat knives drawn, brothers shoulder to shoulder. The orcs still rushed on, stumbling over their own dead onto the Fist's blades. So many orcs died at the hands of the Astartes that during a lull in the battle, the Sons of Dorn built walls out of their corpses. So determined were the Space Marines that they fought till their blades broke. Then they picked up the orcish axes and guns, and when they too failed, they beat the Greenskins to death with their armored fists. Despite fighting with unparalleled courage, the orcs were too many. Pedro Cantor and his warriors made peace with their death. Facing the orcs with stoic bravery, the Astartes said their goodbyes to each other. Though, as the final tide of orcs came, threatening to bury the Space Marines, they began to fall. Shadowy figures appeared on the cliffs. Orcs sliced to find sashimi by gossamer threads as they charged through the rocky corridor. In a panic, and with the aid of these mysterious warriors, the Crimson Fists routed the orcs and were freed from their certain doom. Upon clearing the gorge of orcs, their saviors revealed themselves as Eldar of Craftworld Alatok. Their Farseer met with Pedro Cantor in what one would describe as one of the few friendly interactions between humanity and the Eldar before the return of Guilliman. But it wasn't perfect. The Farseer had been expecting far more gratitude than what Cantor ultimately gave him. All in all, Cantor was more cautious as to their reasoning. The Eldar Farseer had foreseen that out of these very caves, an orc war boss would arise, one so cunning and clever that it would not only destroy the Crimson Fist, but also their craft world. Thus, the Eldar left the Astartes with a mission to root out the orcs in the rest of the caves, find this would-be war boss unlike any other, and slay him. The Battle for Traitor's Gorge would be the last major event in the total war for Rynn's world, but there was a bit more to the story. Pedro Cantor and his surviving Astartes would begin a guerrilla war against the orcs in the caves. Shedding their power armor, they would slick their bodies in mud and stealthily move through the tunnels, slitting the throats of the orcs that they found, then using their own weapons to gun down the reinforcements. When Cantor and his warriors finally emerged from those caves, the war for Rynn's world would finally be truly over. In the years to come, the Crimson Fist would slowly rebuild, though it would take till the advent of the Primaris Marines to truly end their woes. Still, despite it all, on the anniversary of Arch Tyrannus' destruction, the citizens of New Rynn City gather under a monument to the fall. With hands clasped and eyes closed, they give thanks to those who stood against the end of their world, who held the line despite all the odds. For the family members they lost and all the pain they endured, they give thanks that they are still here. The War for Rynn's world is the original battle in 40K. It's a large part of what this universe is built on, those foundational ideas. Sure, it's changed a lot with the times, but it's still emblematic of the heart of Warhammer. Brave warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, brothers, a thin line holding back the end of humanity in the darkest of times. And sure, the Crimson Fists that we see here aren't really nice. They're not good guys. Most of them are bloodthirsty, crazed by rage, and they despise the mortals they're supposed to protect. Yet there's a glimmer of hope in Cantor, an Astartes powered by the love for his brothers and empathy for those mortals, a hint of hope amongst the darkness of the 41st millennium. Such is the legacy of the Crimson Fists, a faint glimmer, a hope that even in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the spirit of man endures. But what do you think of all this? Does this story give you a newfound appreciation for the Crimson Fists? I'll be honest, I really enjoy when Games Workshop takes a little bit of lore that was only ever meant to be a little bit of background fluff to flavor something from the tabletop game, and then they decide to go all out, expanding on it and writing a whole bunch of novels centered around its events. Now sure, that definitely can and has been handled poorly in the past, as it's always a risky proposition when you're dealing with an event that is seen as sacred by the fans. But the Battle of the Farm being expanded into this? I've got no complaints. I think it's fantastic stuff. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a like if you think I earned it. Leave all your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. As always, big thanks to everyone who supports all the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.